boy's scream cut through the valley like a hawk's cry. He'd slipped, boot torn, ankle twisted, and was sliding down the icy shale, clawing at rock and root as his mother threw herself after him. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she just moved, her long skirts snapping behind her like a sail in storm wind, boots skidding, hands blistering as she caught the edge and slammed her shoulder into stone to keep from tumbling. The mountains didn't care that her boy was 6 and already starving, or that the other one, barely 4, waited up top, holding a burlap sack of hickory nuts with both arms like it was gold. The freeze had come early, hard, and it had come for the weak first. She caught the boy by the collar just before his head cracked on a rock. He dangled, screaming, then sobbed as she dragged him back to ledge. No comfort, no time. She pressed his head to her chest, more to still his noise than offer peace, then rose, ignoring the blood on her fingers and the iron taste in her mouth from where she'd bitten her lip. The mountains didn't want her family, but they were going to stay. Her name was Ada Brennan, and there were few left who remembered her as anything but a ghost story in these parts. Some said she was a witch, others a widow who'd gone mad, but they hadn't seen what she saw, they hadn't lived what she'd lived, and they hadn't stood where she now stood, beneath a jagged cliffside, snow threatening to seal the pass for good, while 3 days of firewood remained, and both her boys were coughing blood. They wouldn't survive another storm in that broken cabin, but she'd seen something yesterday, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one, a crack in the cliff wall as they searched for chestnuts, a hollow, too low to walk into, too deep to see the end, and warmer, just slightly, than the air around it. She hadn't told the boys, not yet, not until she was sure. But now, as her arms burned from dragging the older one up the slope, and the wind began to shift with that smell, sharp, bitter, electric, like lightning trapped in snow, she made her choice. They were going to that cave, and they were going to make it theirs, even if it killed her. They abandoned the cabin by dusk, took only what they could carry, the last of the smoked venison, a tin pot, flint and steel, a half-used candle stub, and the thickest quilt Ada had stitched last spring. The rest she buried in the crawl space. The floorboards were already warping with frost, the hearth cracked, chimney leaking smoke so bad she'd woken twice thinking the place was burning down. "I don't want to leave Papa's cabin," the little one whispered as she tied his scarf tighter. She didn't answer, didn't lie to him either. The truth was they'd already lost that cabin weeks ago. She just hadn't let herself admit it until now. They walked through moonlight, wrapped in rags and silence, the forest groaning above them, trees cracked from the cold. Something howled in the distance. She didn't believe in wolves anymore, not this close to the ridges, but she kept the iron poker strapped to her back all the same. The boys didn't speak again, just followed. Because when Ada moved like this, shoulders squared, eyes ahead, hand always brushing the pouch of tinder at her hip, they knew better than to ask questions. She reached the cliff just before midnight. The cave mouth had narrowed since yesterday, crusted with ice now, nearly invisible behind a spray of frozen moss. She had to lift both boys through first, then slither in sideways, holding her breath until she felt earth instead of air beneath her boots. Then they were inside, dark, still, not silent. No cave is, but still, the kind of stillness that swallows your heartbeat, that muffles breath and memory. She lit the candle. The glow flickered, gold and weak, but enough to show the chamber stretched farther than she'd hoped. She crept forward, dragging one boy by the sleeve while the other clung to her back. The walls narrowed, then widened again into what felt like a natural pocket, some old erosion hollow, maybe 20 feet across. Ceiling sloped and rough but dry. More important, no wind. And the floor, not ice. Damp earth, yes, but not frozen. She pressed her hand to it, then the back of her wrist. It was warmer than outside, even just by a few degrees. But in this kind of cold, a few degrees could mean the difference between frostbite and sleep, between sleep and death. "We'll stay," she murmured, and that night they did. The freeze hit full the next morning. They heard it coming from inside the cave, branches snapping, wind screaming through the high pass like a devil's shriek, the kind of storm that buried cabins and choked chimneys and froze water inside a pot. But inside the cave, they stayed dry, not warm, but not dead. She rationed food, started a smokeless fire using pine twigs and dry moss in a ring of stones near the back. The air vented through some unseen crack in the ceiling, just enough to keep from choking them, but not enough to draw in the cold. The candle burned out by dawn, but she used flint sparingly, kept it going with patience and breath. She lined the walls with their clothes during the day to dry them, let the boys sleep wrapped in the quilt while she crushed stones together in a makeshift circle to hold warmth longer. She remembered old stories, ones her mother used to tell, about shepherds in Ireland using turf and stone to trap heat in caves during famine years. She tried it. It worked, barely, and slowly the cave became home. She carved notches into the wall with her knife to mark time. Day 1, day 2, day 3. The older boy's cough stopped worsening. The younger started to laugh again, once at least, when a squirrel darted in, chasing their food smell, and she scared it off with a scream. But the food was running low, and if she didn't find a way to make the cave truly warm, survivably warm, then it didn't matter how long they could last. They would all die in the dark. It came to her on the 5th night. She was half asleep, hand still clutching the poker like a club, when a drip of moisture from the cave ceiling hit her cheek. She blinked awake, shivering, and watched another droplet fall, then another. The cave was sweating, condensation, warm air hitting cold stone. That meant the deeper recesses were warmer. There was something behind this hollow, a thermal pocket maybe, some old fault line warmed by trapped geothermal air. She'd read about such things in discarded books her husband once hauled from a mining camp. She waited until the boys were asleep, then crept back toward the rear of the chamber, crawled through a side crack she hadn't dared try before. It was tight, claustrophobic, nearly panicked her twice, but she made it through. And when she emerged, the second chamber was real, smaller, lower, but unmistakably warmer. Her breath didn't fog, her fingers didn't sting, and suddenly she had a plan. She sealed the outer cave mouth tighter with snow and stone, stacking it in a low wall and pressing branches over it to block the worst wind. She built up the fire ring in the warmer inner pocket, cut a draft hole with her knife through the cave's thinnest point, using the tip of a broken shovel she'd scavenged from the cabin weeks ago. She created layers, cloth, moss, rock, anything to trap heat, anything to hold warmth longer. She turned a cave into a shelter, and still she feared it wouldn't be enough, because the storm hadn't ended, and the food was gone, and something was wrong with the older boy's breathing again. But she didn't stop. She kept working, because she knew no one was coming. No help, no neighbors, no riders on horseback with bags of flour or sugar. If she didn't save them, no one would. And the cave, this miserable, frozen, God-forsaken hole, was all she had left. The boy didn't speak for half the day. He just lay still beneath the quilt, curled tight with his brother beside him, cheeks sunken and pale as frostbitten birch bark. His breath came in soft, wet wheezes now. Ada sat nearby, back against the cave wall, sharpening the poker to a rough point against a stone, even though she knew it wouldn't be much use. Not against cold, not against fever, but she had to do something. Hands idle was death. That's what old Mr. Hahn used to say before the winter took him last year, and Ada was beginning to believe it. Every muscle in her body ached from days of huddling in cold, damp stone. Her fingers were swollen, her lips cracked so badly they bled with every word, but she kept whispering to her boys, even when they didn't respond. Words were warmth too, maybe not enough, but more than silence. "You remember the fish in rock, Jamie?" she whispered, stroking her older son's forehead with the edge of her thumb. "The one Papa showed you down at Bitter Bend?" The boy blinked, a slow flicker, his mouth barely parted. "You caught the big one, remember that?" A faint nod. She swallowed. Her throat felt like dry pine bark. "I'll take you back there. As soon as it thaws, I'll carve you a new pole. We'll use the line I've been saving. You remember where?" No answer, but she saw the smallest twitch of his lips. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his temple, held it there for a while, pretending not to feel how hot his skin was. Fever. He was burning up, and they were surrounded by cold. By midday, the wind outside had dropped into an eerie stillness. It wasn't warmth. No, that would have been a miracle. It was the kind of stillness that only came between blizzards. A lull, a trap. She'd seen it before, snow pausing just long enough to make you step outside, to make you think it was over, then slamming down harder than before. But she had no choice. They'd eaten the last of the venison yesterday. All that remained was a bit of bark paste she'd made from boiled pine inner bark. Bitter, barely edible, and barely a spoonful left. The boys were past hunger now. That's when it got dangerous. Children could survive cold longer than most men, but not without food, so she crawled back out. The cave's outer wall was nearly iced shut. She had to dig through with her hands, numb and red, until she emerged into the brittle sunlight. It was so bright it hurt. The sky above was blindingly blue, the kind of color that never brought warmth, only warnings. It meant the clouds were building behind the mountains. She had maybe 4 hours, 5 if she was lucky. She ran. She ran with a fire poker and a torn burlap sack. That was all. No rifle, no traps, no rope, just her battered boots and frostbitten fingers. But she knew these woods, knew them like her own breath. and she knew where the last caches of acorns might be, where squirrels sometimes buried too close to the surface, where ice thinned enough that she could crack through and maybe, just maybe, spear something in the stream with the poker. She reached the grove just as the wind shifted, not strong, just enough to make her flinch. An omen. She scanned the ground, kicking through old leaves, frozen flat as tin. Nothing. She dropped to her knees and began scraping at the dirt with her fingers. She didn't care that they bled, didn't stop when she tore a nail, just dug. One acorn, then two. Cracked, useless. The third was whole, so was the fourth. By the time the light began to shift behind the trees, she had a half-dozen, just enough to boil into something barely worthy of the name porridge. But she needed more. She raced to the stream, fell twice, tore her skirt, slipped on a patch of shale, and landed hard on her hip. But she kept moving. The water was barely flowing under a thin crust of ice. She took the poker and stabbed downward, again and again, until it cracked. She plunged her hand into the freezing flow and waited. A flash, a silver dart, tiny, fast, skimmed past her wrist. She slammed the poker down, missed, tried again, missed again. The third time, she didn't miss. She pulled a minnow barely the length of her palm from the water. Tiny, pathetic, but it flopped in her hand like a miracle. She bit down on the nausea rising in her throat and slipped it into the sack. When she returned to the cave, dusk was falling fast. The wind had begun to howl again, and her oldest boy was unconscious. She didn't scream, not at first. She didn't have the breath. She just dropped the sack and fell to her knees beside him, pressing her ear to his chest. There was a sound, faint, but there. He was still breathing. She fed him drops of melted snow laced with boiled pine, rubbed his chest with the last of the bear fat they'd found in a canister last month. Then she built a new fire in the inner pocket of the cave, this time tighter, smarter. She stacked rocks around the flame to hold the heat longer. She roasted the acorns slowly, crushed them between stones, added water from the melted stream ice. It made a slurry so bitter it almost choked her, but she cooled it, spooned it into the boy's mouth, and prayed. He swallowed. Not much, but enough. Then she fed the younger one. He was shivering hard now, more scared than sick. But he ate. He even smiled when she gave him the minnow, roasted to a crisp over the flame. "Is that fish?" he asked, mouth full. She nodded. "Biggest I ever saw." He laughed once before coughing, then curled up under the quilt and fell asleep. That night, Ada didn't sleep. She didn't dare. The cave was still holding warmth, but the wind outside had picked up again. Ice crystals slithered through the narrowest cracks, whispering like voices. She sat by the fire, knees tucked to her chest, and stared into the flames. And then just past midnight, she heard the crunch, not from inside the cave. Outside, snow, heavy, compacting under something bigger than a squirrel. Her hand shot to the poker. Another crunch. She pressed her body low to the floor, crawled to the sealed entrance, and listened. There, movement, something, or someone, was out there. She waited, breath silent, ears burning, and then she heard it, a cough. Not animal, human. She froze. No one should be up here. Not in this cold, not in this storm, and no one knew about the cave, unless... She didn't move for 20 minutes, not until the footsteps receded, not until the wind drowned out every other sound. When she did finally crawl back to the boys, her legs trembled so hard she thought they'd give out. She lay beside them, arms wrapped tight, eyes wide open. Someone was out there, but who? And why hadn't they knocked? Morning came slow and grey. The storm had laid heavy snow across the cave entrance, muffling all sound. She had to chip her way out again, careful not to wake the boys. The woods beyond looked still. No tracks, no blood, no sign of anything. She told herself it had been the wind, the mountain playing tricks. But when she looked closer at the base of the cave's wall, where the ice had thinned, she saw it, a handprint pressed into the snow, large, human, and fresh. Ada didn't tell the boys. She just reinforced the cave wall with more stone, sealed the vent holes better, moved the fire deeper into the warm pocket, and sharpened the poker again. Not that it would help, but she'd been a wife once. She'd buried a man who knew how to kill, and now she was mother, guardian, builder, hunter, nurse, and soldier. She would protect what was hers, no matter who or what came knocking next. She didn't sleep again for the next 3 nights. It wasn't the cold that kept her eyes wide and raw, or the echo of wind dragging like claws across the ridge above. It was that handprint, that perfectly shaped palm in the snow, too large to be hers, fingers thick and pressed with purpose. Not some drunken imprint of a wanderer or accident of weather. Someone had come to the cave, someone had stood inches from where her boys slept, and then they'd left, without a word, without a sound. But why? She had no answers, no signs of return. The snow the next morning had buried the print. The forest was silent again, blanketed thick and cruel, and no new tracks appeared. Still, Ada didn't trust it. The mountains had ways of hiding evil things in plain silence. She kept the fire in the inner chamber, always low and always covered. She forced herself to eat even when she couldn't stomach it, forced her boys to chew bark porridge, and roasted pine cones even when they wept from the taste. And always, always her hand never left the poker, because she knew the truth. You didn't survive in these mountains by trusting quiet. You survived by preparing for what followed it. On the 5th morning after the handprint, the youngest boy woke her with a cough so sharp it sprayed blood onto the quilt. She didn't scream, didn't sob, just turned him on his side, bundled the fabric tight, and ran her fingers down his spine, checking for the fever. It wasn't there, thank God, but his breathing had changed, shallower, faster. He wasn't dying, not yet, but he would be if she didn't do something soon. The cave, for all its warmth, wasn't enough anymore. She'd pushed its structure to the limits. The stones she'd stacked held the heat well enough, and the inner chamber was still 3, maybe 4 degrees above freezing. But that didn't stop the frost that crept in when the wind curved wrong, or the rain dripped through one of the ceiling cracks and froze solid along the wall. She'd used every piece of cloth to insulate. She'd even tried digging deeper, but the floor was too hard, too rocky, and her makeshift shovel barely chipped it. She needed something more, and she knew what. She needed fire that lasted, fire that didn't burn out the moment she blinked. Something steady, something low and hot, something that would turn this frozen tomb into something more like a home. And that meant only one thing. She had to go back to the cabin. The thought alone made her want to vomit. But there was no choice. There had been bricks there, just a few, scavenged years ago from a collapsed storehouse on the western ridge. Her husband had planned to build a chimney box with them someday, back when they'd first cleared the homestead. But then he died, and the bricks had just sat there, half buried near the lean-to, covered in snow and moss. But if she could haul those bricks back here, if she could set them into a fire ring, pack the gaps with mud from the creek bend, even try baking a stone oven with it, maybe, just maybe. So she waited until the boys were asleep, their coughs quieted into a damp rhythm. She pressed her lips to both their foreheads, tied the poker to her waist, then crawled out into the dark. The snow was thicker than before. It came to her knees in places, her skirt soaked through in minutes. But she didn't stop. She moved fast, fast as she dared, using trees as guideposts, weaving a path she hadn't walked in over a week. Every step felt like it might be the one that broke her ankle or twisted her knee. But the cabin wasn't far, 2 ridges over, and if she timed it right, she could be back by dawn. The first sign something was wrong came as she passed the creek bend. Footprints, fresh, not hers, not the boys', too large, too deep, and there, by the thicket edge, scraps of hide. Not animal, not fallen from a coat, laid, intentionally. A message. She didn't stop to investigate, just moved faster, ignoring the pounding in her skull. The wind began to pick up. By the time she saw the cabin's silhouette through the trees, the snow was horizontal, a full squall rising, and that's when she saw it. The door was open, just slightly. She froze. The wind hissed past her, sending flakes in sideways sheets. No prints near the door. They'd been blown over. No smoke from the chimney. She'd expected that. But that door! She'd locked it, bolted it. She remembered it like she remembered her husband's dying breath. Ada crouched low, moved in slow, heart punching against her ribs. The poker slid into her hand as she reached the porch. 1 step, 2. She pushed the door open. The cabin was empty, but not untouched. Someone had been here. The floor had been swept, deliberately. The blanket on the cot had been moved, its corners turned down as if waiting for someone to lie in it. And in the center of the room, in the very spot where she'd buried the last of their salted flour beneath a loose board, the board had been pulled up. The food was gone, but not stolen, not scattered, not torn, gone, lifted as if carefully carried. She knelt, ran her hand through the space beneath the floor, and there, wedged into the corner, was something that hadn't been there before, a single blackened matchstick, used. She didn't take time to cry. Not then, not yet. She grabbed the bricks, 6 of them, still frozen to the ground, and hacked them free with the poker. She bundled them in her shawl, wrapped tight, and tied it to her waist. Nearly 60 pounds of weight, enough to break a back. And then she ran. She made it back by dawn, nearly collapsed into the cave mouth, snow-covered and wild-eyed. Her fingers were black at the tips. Her lips split so deep she couldn't speak for a minute. But she was alive. The boys were asleep. The fire had died, but not completely. A bed of coals remained. She stoked them, fed twigs, blazed it back. Then, using the last of her strength, she began to build. The brick fire ring took her the entire day. The mortar was nothing but mud and moss. The bricks cracked in places, but she stacked them tight, then packed stone around the outside for insulation. She even scraped pitch from a pine tree branch and sealed the bottom edge with it. By dusk, the fire was lit inside it. By nightfall, The cave felt warmer. By morning, the boys were coughing less. But the matchstick stayed in her pocket. A reminder someone had been in that cabin, had seen the food, had taken it, but not destroyed anything, had left signs of care, had followed her trail back to the cave, and chosen, for now, not to approach. She had theories, all of them bad. The next night, the whispering started. Not the wind, not the water. Voices, low, ragged, outside the cave. She didn't investigate, didn't sleep, just sat with the poker gripped in her lap, fire low, eyes fixed on the entrance. The boys stirred but didn't wake, and the whispering eventually faded. But it returned the next night, and the night after that, and each time it was louder, closer. She fortified the cave entrance with rocks, dug a pit just inside, covered it with sticks and snow. She knew it wouldn't stop a man, but it might buy her seconds, might be enough. The food was gone again. She made pine needle broth. It tasted like ash, but she fed it to the boys, kept them wrapped tight near the brick fire. The older one asked if they'd see Papa soon. She told him yes, because lies can warm a child better than truth. And then, on the 7th night, she saw the eyes, glowing, faint, like foxfire in the snow. Outside the cave, through a gap in the stones, 2 eyes, not animal, set too high, too steady, watching. She stood, heart frozen solid, and stepped toward them. The eyes didn't blink. Then, slowly, they turned and vanished into the dark. The whispers didn't come back after that. Neither did the eyes. But in their place came tracks, circling the cave, wide arcs in the snow, always fresh, always just beyond where her firelight reached. Watching, testing, she kept her boys close. She didn't cry, she didn't break, but one night, when both boys slept, soundly for the first time in days, and the fire burned steady in the brick ring, she whispered something aloud for the first time in weeks. "If you're out there," she said, voice hoarse and low, "and you mean to take us, do it now." Silence. "I'm not afraid of dying." The cave didn't answer. The wind didn't howl. The snow didn't fall. She waited, and in that stillness, terrible, long, hollow, something moved in her that hadn't stirred in months. Not fear, not rage, something deeper, resolve. And as she sat there, back straight, poker laid across her lap like a sword, she knew something had changed. Because the cave wasn't just shelter anymore. It was hers, and no one, not man, beast, or ghost, was going to take it. She no longer flinched when the ice shifted above them. The sound of cracking frost, the moan of wind curling through hidden vents. It was all part of the cave's language now. It groaned like an old body. It breathed. It even had moods. Some days it welcomed her, dry, quiet, nearly warm. Other days it howled and spat icy breath down the tunnels until she could see her own frost-bitten ribs through holes in her shirt. But she no longer feared it, because the cave had not taken her children, not yet, and so long as they breathed, so would she. Even if her own hands had gone stiff and purple, even if her breath came shallow, and each step felt like dragging iron chains, even if her heartbeat slowed so much that sometimes, in those long, still hours before dawn, she wasn't sure she still had one. She was still here, and so were they. It had been 24 days since they'd left the cabin. She only knew that because of the notches she'd carved into the wall by the fire pit, one each morning. It was a ritual now, like prayer, except she didn't pray anymore, not to the God she once knew, not after the mountain had taken everything, not after he'd let her husband die coughing blood on a mattress they shared, not after he'd sent the freeze weeks early, with no warning, no mercy, not after the last rider passed them on the ridge and never returned. God had gone quiet, but the mountain hadn't, so she spoke to it instead. "Let them wake warm today," she whispered on the 24th morning as she bent low and breathed new life into the coals beneath the brick stove. "Let the fire hold." She fed it bark strips, pine resin, her own hair once when the wind snuffed it too fast. She learned how to build it blind by feel. The bricks, her hoarded prize, still held heat. She pressed her hands against them every hour, watching the frost on the boys' lashes melt in the faint warmth. They'd grown quieter, not just from sickness, but from hunger. Their cheeks were narrow now, eyes deep. They no longer asked for sugar or bread or fish. They simply waited. When she handed them pine tea, they drank it without words. She tried to smile when she looked at them, but it always felt like lying. The second cave chamber, the warmer pocket, had grown strange in recent days. The earth there had begun to steam faintly, just wisps, barely visible, but they meant something. The floor beneath was warm enough now that her boots no longer stuck to frost. Geothermal heat. She remembered the term from a book her husband once read aloud by firelight. Steam from deep underground, a crack in the mountain's bones. It might kill them eventually, boil them from beneath, or flood the cave in gas, but it was also the only reason they were still alive. She dug into the slope wall of the second chamber with the fire poker. Not much, just enough to shape a pocket, a hollow where the warmth pooled. She lined it with moss and dry grass, moved the boys there each night, like nesting birds. She called it the cradle. They didn't ask why, they just curled into it. On the 30th day, the first boy stopped coughing, not because he was better, because there wasn't enough left in him to cough. Ada sat by him for hours, holding his hand. It was so light now, like it didn't belong to a child, like it had been carved from candle wax and left too close to the fire. She told him a story, her favorite, one her mother had told her during a thunderstorm, long before Ada had ever seen a mountain. It was about a little girl who followed a fox into the woods and found a valley that never knew winter. The trees there never lost their leaves. The rivers never froze, and the girl lived there forever, warm and fed and free. "I'll take you there," she said softly. He didn't respond, didn't blink, but she felt the tiniest pressure in his fingers. So she told the story again and again, until the light outside dimmed and the whispering returned. This time, she didn't ignore it. She waited until both boys were asleep in the cradle. Then she pulled on her stiff shawl, tied the poker to her belt, and crept out through the snow-packed entrance. The forest was still, too still. Even the wind was holding its breath. She moved slow, bare feet in frozen boots, past the trees toward the creek, past the ridge where the prince had once circled, past the fallen pine she used to sit on when her boys were little, back when winters were kind and the world still had color. There, by the ash tree, was the source of the whisper, a figure, human, kneeling. By the time the thaw came, she barely remembered what a road looked like. Snow had buried every trail that once led to the ridge, every winding deer path her husband used to walk, every foot-worn line through the woods where men hauled timber in the fall. In its place were only shadows and drifts, white dunes that shifted shape day by day, sometimes twice before noon, swallowing rocks and logs and frozen stumps until the mountain itself felt like a stranger. But the cave had endured, and so had they. The boys weren't better yet, not fully. The elder had started coughing again, though not as sharp. The younger now moved slower, his voice hoarse and low, but they were alive. Their eyes opened each morning, their breaths came steady, their ribs didn't poke so sharply from under their shirts, and that was more than most could say from what the woman had told her. Others had died, cabins collapsed under the snow, men went out for firewood and didn't come back, children froze in their beds. She didn't ask how many, didn't want to know, but it was clear now that what had happened in their little shelter wasn't common. It was something else. The woman had returned again, 2 nights after the thaw began. Her face had changed, less drawn but quieter. Her hands no longer shook when she pulled food from her pack, and this time she brought no trade, only questions. "Tell me again how you found this place," Ada had answered. "Tell me how you built the stove," Ada had shown her. "Tell me when you stopped being afraid." To that, Ada had said nothing, but the woman had smiled like that was the answer she expected. Then she'd sat near the fire for a long while, listening to the boys sleep, listening to the small sounds of the brick hearth popping under the warmth. "You know," she said quietly, "some would call what you've done here impossible." Ada stirred the coals with the tip of her iron poker. She hadn't let it out of her hand in days. "It wasn't impossible," she said. "It was just necessary," and the woman nodded. Later that week, others came, not to the cave directly, but nearby. She saw them from the ridge one morning while gathering snowmelt. 3 figures, bundled heavy, riding slowly along the old trail. They didn't speak, didn't wave, but they were watching. The next morning they left a bundle at the cave mouth. No words, just food, blankets, and a note etched into wood. "You are not alone." Ada had held the block in her hand for a long time, not sure whether to be grateful or afraid. The boys, still half asleep, didn't ask what it said, but she didn't throw it away. She kept it by the fire, next to the poker. As days passed, the light grew longer, snow thinned, the mountain groaned differently, less like a threat, more like a body waking from sleep, and with it came voices, real ones, children, laughter. Somewhere in the woods, not far, maybe half a mile down a slope, others had returned, or survived, or found each other. She never saw them clearly, never approached, but sometimes, when the wind blew right, she could hear pots clanging, someone chopping wood, a dog barking, life rising again from the frost. She knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. The food, while more abundant now, would not last without foraging. The fire, though steady, was beginning to eat through the last of the good bark. Her bones ached every morning. Her hands had stopped bleeding, but her fingers were gnarled and stiff. She couldn't lift the older boy without bracing her back first. Couldn't kneel long without shaking, but it didn't matter, because spring was coming, and spring changed everything. On the 50th day, she packed what little they had into a woven sack, just enough food for a day, a few pieces of bark for tinder, and the flint stones she kept tied in a strip of deer hide. She wrapped the boys in their heaviest layers, tied her poker through her belt again, and led them out of the cave, out of the dark, into light. They walked slowly. The boys hadn't used their legs much in weeks, and they staggered often. She carried the younger half the way, resting him on her hip like she had when he was a toddler. He didn't talk, just clung to her scarf with one fist, head pressed to her shoulder. The ridge above the old trail was slushy and uneven. At one point, the elder boy slipped, landing hard on his palms, and began to cry, but the tears stopped fast. Ada helped him up, kissed his knuckles, and pointed to the far ridge. "There," she said softly. "See that bend in the trees?" He nodded. "That's where we go." They made it by nightfall, a clearing, the remains of a cabin, barely more than a fire circle, and a tarp nailed to a slanted log. But it was warm, a fire already burning. 2 women tending a pot, a man carving bark from a sapling, and children, 4 or 5, bundled in old coats, chasing each other through puddles. When the group saw her, no one moved at first. Then the man stood, walked forward slowly. "You Ada?" he asked. She didn't answer, just stared. The woman behind him stepped forward, the same one who'd come to her in the woods. "She's the one," the woman said. "The cave mother." Ada flinched. "I'm not." But the words died, because the woman was smiling, not like someone who believed in magic, like someone who believed in proof. That night, they sat around the fire, and she told her story again. But this time others listened, and not just to marvel, to learn. She showed them how she built the stove, described the steam pocket, told them about the moss wall, the cradle, the stone ring. A boy, barely 12, asked how she started fires without smoke. She showed him. A woman asked how she boiled acorns to remove the poison. She explained, and the children stared like it was a miracle. But it wasn't. She hadn't conjured anything. She had simply endured, and in doing so, she had given the mountain something it had never seen before, a mother who refused to die quietly. Weeks passed. The thaw grew stronger. The snow shrank from the trees. Birds returned. Streams flowed. And from up on the ridge, the cave still sat in silence, undisturbed, its fire ring cold, its cradle empty. She took the boys back once. Just once. They walked slowly, hand in hand, up the trail, past the pine tree and the creek. The entrance had iced over again. She cleared it with her hands. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. She walked through each chamber, touched the stones, sat by the brick hearth, and when the boys asked if they could light the fire again, she smiled. Not today. They didn't ask why. The cave had saved them, but it was no longer theirs. It had given them what they needed. Now, it would wait for someone else. And when the next storm came, next year, next decade, 100 winters from now, it would still be there, holding heat in its walls, holding stories in its stone, waiting for the next mother, the next child, the next desperate soul looking for warmth in a world made of ice and silence. And maybe, just maybe, it would save them too. In the new camp, Ada no longer felt like a ghost. She taught others how to build stoves from rock and moss, how to make broth from bark, how to dig the floor deep enough to hold the day's heat through the night. She wasn't anyone's leader, wasn't anyone's preacher, or savior or saint. But people listened when she spoke. They passed her name around the fire, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with reverence, but always with respect. Because in the dead of winter, when the world froze and hope ran out, one woman had taken 2 sick children into a hole in the earth and walked out again with fire in her hands.